Okay, let's talk about Le Chevalier C. Auguste Dupin. He is a fictional character created by Edgar Allan Poe. Dupin made his first appearance in Poe's 1841 short story, The Murders in the Rue Morgue, widely considered the first detective fiction story. He reappears in The Mystery of Marie Rogêt and The Purloined Letter. Dupin is not a professional detective, and his motives for solving the mysteries change throughout the three stories. Using what Poe termed logic, Dupin combines his considerable intellect with creative imagination, even putting himself in the mind of the criminal. His talents are strong enough that he appears able to read the mind of his companion, the unnamed narrator, in all three stories. Poe created Dupin's character before the word detective had been coined. The character laid the groundwork for fictional detectives to come, including Sherlock Holmes, and established most of the common elements of the detective fiction genre. Let's take a look at the character background. Dupin is from what was once a wealthy family. The title Chevalier means a knight of the royal order. But by a variety of untold events, has been reduced to more humble circumstances and contents himself only with the basic necessities of life. But he doesn't have a job. Okay, he has enough money so he doesn't have to work. He just has to be really careful about how he spends his money. He now lives in Paris with his close friend, the anonymous narrator of the stories. The two met by accident while both were searching for the same rare and very remarkable volume in an obscure library. This scene, the two characters searching for a hidden text, serves as a metaphor for detection. They promptly move to an old manor located outside of Paris. For hobbies, Dupin is fond of enigmas, conundrums, and Egyptian hieroglyphics. He bears the title Chevalier, meaning that he is a knight of the Legion of Honor. Dupin shares some features with later gentleman detective, a character type that became common in the golden age of detective fiction. He is acquainted with the police prefect G, who appears in all three stories seeking his counsel. In The Murders in the Rue Morgue, Dupin investigates the murder of a mother and a daughter in Paris. He investigates another murder in The Mystery of Marie Rogêt. This story was based on the true story of Marie Rogers, a saleswoman at a cigar store in Manhattan, whose body was found floating in the Hudson River in 1841. Dupin's final appearance in The Purloined Letter features an investigation of a letter stolen from the French Queen. Poe called this story perhaps the best of my tales of logic. Throughout the three stories, Dupin travels through three different distinct settings. In the Murders in the Rue Morgue, he travels through city streets. In the Mystery of Marie Rogêt, he is in the wide outdoors. And in the Purloined Letter, he is in an enclosed private space. Dupin is not actually a professional detective, and his motives change through his appearances. In the Murders in the Rue Morgue, he investigates the murders for personal amusement and to prove the innocence of a falsely accused man. He also owes that guy a debt, too. So he refuses a financial reward. However, in the Purloined Letter, Dupin purposely pursues a financial reward, and a very handsome one at that. Dupin's method is in matters beyond the limits of mere rule that the skill of the analyst is evidenced. He makes in silence a host of observation and inferences. From Gavin Rees, from gavinrees.com, his essay on C. Auguste Dupin states, Edgar Allan Poe is a name that most of us heard at school due to his classic literature fiction. His books are famous all around the world and is well known for his detective short stories. One of the characters Poe wrote about was C. Auguste Dupin, a gentleman living in Paris and by profession a detective. Poe wrote 3 short stories about the detective and include Murders in the Rue Morgue, The Purloined Letter, and The Mystery of Marie Rogêt. The first 2 being highly successful, while the last one being comparatively less successful. The character depicted a reclusive man who prefers his own company and prefers to work at night in candlelight. He smokes a Mersholm pipe and even has a sidekick just like Sherlock Holmes. Dupin is shown as a character that likes to stay away from the traditional ways of law enforcement, preferring to develop his own techniques in innovative ways to solve the mysteries he is presented with. In the short stories, he believes that the French police way of investigating are stale and unoriginal. He believes the police get distracted by bigger details of the case, forgetting the important finer details. For example, in the first story by Poe, the police were so fixated on the gruesome nature of the double homicide that they forgot to check the windows which hold the clue to the murder. Dupin views a crime scene as a scientist or mathematician by removing his emotions and looking at it objectively. He tries to gather all the tiny details and calculate the moves in the murderer as one would in a chess game. In the second short story, the police do not want to get involved in a political situation, which is why they tiptoe around the whole situation, while Dupin knows that by getting involved, he may be able to figure out exactly how to solve the mystery. Dupin is a well-constructed and even enjoyable character. He has a reflection of the times and may have been a nudge to the police that they need to do better work. His character had some good qualities along with witty comments and humorous moments too. Even Dupin is most appreciated for the new and innovative ways he came up with to deal with mysteries around him. Reading such stories helps the reader realize that the same old technique may not always present a solution to a problem. Also, that innovation and creativity will always get you the best results. Edgar Allan Poe, The Murders of the Rue Morgue. While discussing Dupin's method in the light of Charles Sanders Peirce's logic of making good guesses or abductive reasoning, Nancy Horowitz's first quotes Poe's definition of analysis and then shows how Poe is running the gamut of possibilities here. Inferences, reasoning backwards, visual, sensual, and aoral science, reading faces. Playing cards with this man would have been an interesting experience. There is considerable controversy about the philosophical nature of Dupin's method. According to biographer Joseph Crutch, Dupin is portrayed as a dehumanizing thinking machine, a man whose sole interest is pure logic. According to Crutch, Dupin's detective prowess is first exhibited when he appears to read the narrator's mind by rationally tracing his train of thought from the previous 15 minutes. Dupin's method is to identify with the criminal and put himself in his mind. By knowing everything that the criminal knows, he can solve any crime. His attitude towards life seems to portray him as a snob who feels that due to his aptitude, normal human interaction and relationships are beneath him. In this method, he combines his science logic and artistic imagination. As an observer, he pays special attention to what is unintended, such as hesitation, eagerness, or a casual or inadvertent word. Dupin's method also emphasizes the importance of reading and writing. Many of his clues come from newspapers or written reports from the prefect. This device also engages the readers who follow along by reading the clues themselves. Inspiration. Poe may have gotten the last name Dupin from a character in a series of stories first published in Burton's Gentleman's Magazine in 1828, called The Unpublished Passages of the Life of Vidocq, the French Minister of Police. The name implies duping or deception, a skill Dupin shows off in the Purloined Letter. Detective fiction, however, had no real precedent, and the word detective had not yet been coined when Poe first introduced Dupin. In writing the series of Dupin's tales, Poe capitalized on contemporary popular interest. His use of an orangutan in The Murders in the Rue Morgue was inspired by the popular reaction to an orangutan that had been displayed at the Masonic Hall in Philadelphia in July 1839. In the Mystery of Marie Rogêt, he used a true story that had become of national interest. Literary significance and influence. Sherlock Holmes is one of several detectives influenced by Dupin. C. Auguste Dupin is generally acknowledged as the first detective of fiction. The character served as the prototype for many that were created later, including Sherlock Holmes by Arthur Conan Doyle and Hercule Poirot by Agatha Christie. Conan Doyle once wrote, "Each of Poe's detective stories is a root from which a whole literature has developed." Where was the detective story until Poe breathed the breath of life into it? Many tropes would later become commonplace, and detective fiction first appeared in Poe's stories. The eccentric but brilliant detective, the bumbling constabulary, the first-person narrative by a close personal friend. Dupin also initiates the storytelling device, where the detective announces his solution and then explains the reasoning leading up to it. Like Sherlock Holmes, Dupin uses his considerable deductive prowess and observation to solve crimes. Poe also portrays the police as an unsympathetic manner, as a sort to foil the detective. The character helped establish the genre of detective fiction, distinct from mystery fiction, with an emphasis on the analysis and not trial and error. Breda Matthews wrote, "The true detective story as Poe conceived it is not in the mystery itself, but rather in the successive steps whereby the analytic observer is able to solve the problem that might be dismissed as beyond human elucidation." In fact, in the three stories which star Dupin, Poe created three types of detective fiction, which established a model for all future stories. The physical type in The Murders of the Rue Morgue, the mental type in The Mystery of Marie Rogêt, and a balanced version of both in The Purloined Letter. Okay, so that's quite a bit on the Chevalier, and we'll move on to our next slide from here. Okay, Monsieur C. Auguste Dupin in The Murders in the Rue Morgue. This is from shmoop.com, commentary on Auguste Dupin. We're not knocking on Poe's genius by admitting that Dupin isn't fully fleshed out as a character. After all, he's not really meant to be a rounded character. He's most notable for the role he plays in The Murders in the Rue Morgue, for taking the many clues presented during the course of the story and assembling them into a whole. Remember, The Murders in the Rue Morgue is a new kind of story, less interested in depth of character than in engaging the reader in logic games. In other words, The Murders in the Rue Morgue is like a database of evidence: the 3 silver spoons, the 20 or 30 blood-smeared gray hairs, the windows locked from the inside. And Dupin is like the search engine that picks out what we need to know when we can't figure it out for ourselves. Most of the details Poe gives us about Dupin's background and interest seem designed to show us that he's not really great at playing with others. Dupin comes from a great family that's fallen on hard times. This means that he has a private income, but still has to live on a tight budget. As a result, he doesn't have to work for a living, but also doesn't have the social or political obligations of someone from an aristocratic background who still has lots of money. We learn that Dupin spends what little money he has on books, and he and the narrator become friends when they're both looking for the same volume at a library in Paris. We get the sense that Dupin might not be the most social or extroverted of characters. Neither Dupin nor the narrator seem like they belong to a book club, in other words. Dupin doesn't exactly hate other people. After all, he's willing to live with the narrator, and we can't help but notice on the narrator's dime, meaning that Dupin is living off his friend's money. But what he likes, way more than directly interacting with others, is looking at them. He and the narrator never go out during the day, but they love to walk around the Parisian streets at night, checking out the people around them and guessing who they are and where they're from. Why does Dupin keep so separate from the rest of humanity? We think that the key to solving this puzzle lies in his interaction with the narrator. Consider the moments when Dupin suddenly interrupts the silence between them to say exactly what the narrator's thinking out of the blue. He loves watching faces and body language to make deductions, and he values the surfaces of things as the best source of clues for what's going on underneath them. It is this trait that makes Dupin a great detective. He can look beyond obvious clues that confuse the police, and like 4,000 francs on the floor when the police think they have to provide the motive, because who doesn't want lots of money? As we learn, an orangutan, that's who. He sees the small details that indicate what really happened, like the broken nail in the second window frame. But it also makes him hard to deal with as a friend. How would you feel if your best friend kept staring at your face, trying to figure out your feelings, instead of just, asking? He's mostly interested in games, puzzles, philosophizing, and not so much in personal bonding. But, by the way, the last word about Dupin's character: he sneers at the prefect of police, is all head and no body. In his reasoning, he lacks creativity, even though he's got plenty of cunning. But Dupin himself seems to be all brain and no heart. He only gets involved in trying to get Le Bon off the hook because he owes him a favor, not because the guy is innocent. In the first Sherlock Holmes story, A Scarlet Letter, Dr. Watson compares Holmes to Dupin, to which Holmes replies, "No doubt you think you're complimenting me." In my opinion, Dupin was a very inferior fellow. He had some analytical genius, no doubt, but he was by no means such a phenomenon as Poe appears to imagine, alluding to an episode in The Murders in the Rue Morgue, where Dupin deduces what his friend is thinking, despite their having walked together in silence for a quarter of an hour. Holmes remarks that trick of his breaking in on his friend's thoughts was an appropriate remark. It is really very showy and superficial. Nevertheless, Holmes later performs the same trick on Watson in The Adventure of the Cardboard Box.